Welcome to How to Live Slow, the podcast where we discuss slow living for the modern woman and help you design an intentionally slower family life. I'm Rachelle Glendon, your personal slow living coach and host of this podcast. I know all about busy, but I love living slow. Enjoy the show. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of How to Live Slow. It's so great to have you here. I really appreciate you joining me today. This is a bit of a fun episode. I put a poll out on Instagram asking people to vote what episode they'd like to hear, and I think well over 30 people voted. And it was pretty much equal, but it ended up going for the one that we're doing today, obviously. It was a choice between self-leadership for the flexible parent, which will be an episode that comes down the road. That'll be an episode that I do another time. But today's episode is all about how to explain your slow living lifestyle to those who don't get it, whether that's family, friends, work colleagues, just people around you who you feel might judge you or may not understand your choices, or so what I think that really comes down to is how to hold your own boundaries, how to explain them in a way that feels really good. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So like I said, it's a solo episode, so it's just me, and I've got some notes here today. There's quite a lot that goes into this, and this is actually really one of the basis of both my programs, The Slow Life and the Matriarch Way. This is really about self-leadership and kind of like taking back ownership of your power. When I say that, I just mean like we're kind of raised in a world that values the opinions of others over our own, meaning like we have, we revert to experts and we have this collective, air quotes, they that we kind of think are judging us or, rating our opinions. And I think that just comes back to our schooling and, how we've been raised to behave in a certain way and that we've been rated based on our performance, both academically and behaviorally at school, where it's just always kind of felt like someone else knows better and someone is watching us to make sure that we're performing at a particular point, particular level. And so for a lot of us, that's deeply ingrained in us as being, the good girl or the good boy. And, it really does affect us down the line when we become adults and we want to start living a life that's more on our terms. Maybe we've realized that we're just not happy. We're just not really living a life that feels like we're sort of still waiting for our lives to get started. When is someone going to give me permission to do it the way I want to do it? And so that's where self-leadership comes in. We need to give ourselves the permission to do our lives the way that we want to do it. People outside of us aren't the ones who know best for us, actually. I think that that's the thing to really know here. And we need to value our own opinions and our own desires over the judgment of other people. I think that's ultimately, what this comes back to. But to get to that point where we can feel like we, or feel like maybe you relate, maybe you can get to that point where your desires are higher up on your level of priorities than what other people's judgments about your decisions are, or how other people view what you're doing and how you're living your life. To get to that point, we need to do a few things. We need 3 things, and I will share what those 3 things are that we need shortly. But I want to go back to how this is really boundaries, right? We're talking about being able to advocate for ourselves and say no to the things that we don't want to do and say yes to more of what's actually important to us, which means sometimes letting other people down, or often it can mean a big period of feeling like we're about to let a lot of people down. We have to start saying no. So we have to ask ourselves, how did our lack of boundaries start? And that's ultimately what it is, right? It's a lack of boundaries when we don't feel like we can speak up for our own needs. Whether we're thinking of the collective they, the out there people judging us, or if we're thinking about one particular person or one particular group of people, maybe it's family of origin, maybe it's your in-laws, maybe it's people at work or a particular group of friends, maybe your mum, your original mum group, you were allocated by the hospital under no other commonality other than the fact that you all had babies at the same time. Whatever group it is that you feel like you might be letting down, go back to how did those boundaries or lack of boundaries start? What role were you playing that you realized that you had to answer in a particular way? So if you think about your family of origin, and maybe it's got to do with your birth order, or maybe it's just got to do with the family dynamic in general. And your family of origin is obviously the family that you were born into, so your mum and dad and your siblings, grandparents, aunties, uncles, that sort of thing. Your ability to advocate for your own needs stems from how you were brought up, how you were perceived, what role you were given to play within the family, whether you are a boy or a girl, whether you were the oldest, all of those things come into play. And this may actually have stemmed from a very healthy family dynamic when you were young. Like this feeling of being really connected, like we do everything together. I can definitely see this playing out with me and my kids and my husband. We do a lot together. It's very rare that on weekends one of us, we're separated. So we have a very connected family dynamic, but I can see how in the future that may play out as becoming an unhealthy dynamic when our children start to move away, when they start to want outside relationships, potentially when they meet a life partner, and they're torn between. And that's the moment that I think is the key, is that allowing yourself to move away, to let go, both as a child and moving out of the family of origin into kind of like your own little family unit, but also in then letting your children go as well. And for mothers, particularly if you've been exceptionally invested in that dynamic, it can be a very hard thing to do. And it can be very easy to slip into laying on the guilt and laying on, the woe is me. Like that martyr mothering part can really become a bit of a problem as your kids become adults and start their own lives. So that's why we do this work now, so that we can feel fully invested in our motherhood journey while also feeling like we have other things going on as well, so that we're not putting the pressure. So we want to be fully invested in our motherhood journey or our parenthood journey, but without putting the pressure on our kids to validate us back. And that's where healthy dynamics can shift and change. And you can, this is where it seems to fall to us to learn how to hold these boundaries for ourselves, and to take back that power and that become like more self-led, and break out of different dynamics that might have once been healthy that have become unhealthy, or that have become restrictive in some way. Some dynamics are unhealthy even as kids, right? So yeah, we can kind of figure that out as well. Like that may even come into play even more. Like you might even be even more entrenched into a dynamic where you can't have boundaries from your family of origin if it was an unhealthy dynamic growing up as well. But it doesn't necessarily have to all be family of origin. This is definitely playing out in other ways. Like it depends, maybe you've had a corporate job that you've been in for a decade or more, and you've slotted in as the person, like they always say at work. I remember always hearing, if you want something done, give it to the busy person, because they are onto it. But if you're known as the busy person or the productive person, then it's like, it's too much pressure. It's like being the good kid at school. You kind of back yourself into a corner. If you've slotted yourself into that role as being the overachiever or the overcompensator at work, then this can also be something that you have to kind of claim back. And it can be quite confronting for the people who you are giving back responsibility for themselves, if that makes sense. To explain your choices, I think what happens here is we think as well, like if you're listening to this and you're into a slower lifestyle, it's more likely that you're also someone who values a gentle parenting approach or an aware parenting approach. It might be someone who you might identify as being quite introverted, which doesn't necessarily mean shy. You might have considered yourself as being like an easygoing type of person, but then when kids come along, that easygoing nature means that you kind of lose your voice. Or maybe you're the easygoing one, so you've got a partner who's quite extroverted and not overly bossy, but just like the leader of the dynamic between you two. If you're now going, okay, well, I want to take back some of that, there's a lot that's coming up, but a lot that goes on here to make it feel like, if you identify with any of those dynamics, you may find that you feel like speaking up for your own needs or your own boundaries and saying no is going to be a confrontation. Means it's going to start an argument, means that they're going to throw judgments at you, but that's not necessarily always the case. And I will explain that, like I said this just a minute ago, there's 3 things that you need to have in place before you can hold a boundary effectively. And so it comes back to that. So that's how what I'm going to share in those 3 things you need will help you to explain your position without it feeling like a confrontation. Because a confrontation happens when you're not clear, right? So you say it in a way that kind of almost invites them to respond negatively. If you can be clear on what your boundary is and say it in a way that is really strong and you're not seeking permission, you're not kind of like saying like, oh yeah, I would prefer this, or I'd rather if this happened, or whatever. You're not like when you say it more clearly and you've got that strong voice behind you, it's like they can't not agree, but it doesn't have to be a confrontation, if you see what I mean. And this will make more sense in a minute when I explain the other things, but I've got a list here that I want to kind of get through. Yeah, so you may not even actually have to say anything either. Sometimes you can kind of like skirt the topic if you're feeling like you're a little bit nervous to be open and honest about your position around like not wanting to do something. It can feel like you can, like, what I mean here by not having to say anything is you can just like land with a no. You don't have to go into over explaining mode. You don't have to justify yourself in any way, because when you do that, that's another kind of permission seeking behavior, right? You say, oh, this is the reason why I'm letting you down, but it's for a good reason. So please give me permission. Make sure that it's okay. Like, please say that it's okay for me to let you down in this way. And over explaining something kind of makes you seem guilty. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm sure you've seen this playing out before in with the kids or whatever. If you're sick, you're calling in for a sickie at work and you say the reason you can't come to work is because of 10 things. Whereas if you had just one thing, it'd probably seem a bit more legit. So don't feel like you have to over explain yourself. The other thing to note is that you may be really being the brave one, and you might actually be the catalyst that changes the dynamic. And you might be giving permission to others to also hold boundaries. Maybe they are feeling like you're overstepping their boundaries because they can't say no to you because of this weird dynamic that you might be in with them. That kind of like, well, you never say no to them, so they feel like they can't say no to you. So by going first, you can be the leader and you can maybe change the dynamic and have an even deeper, more conscious relationship with that person or that group of people. So that's another thing to kind of think about, because who says other people's opinions are more important anyway? Like, we really need to get to a place where we value ourselves and what we want, right? Let me know if you can hear me, because I'm actually balancing my phone on things. So if you can't hear me properly, please do let me know. So I'm doing this as a live recording on Instagram as well. So the 3 things that you need that I just spoke about, that you need to hold your own boundaries and explain yourself and your position that you want to live a little slower and that you're not available for everything, is that you need a really strong why. That, I feel like that goes without saying, right? But what that means is that by not having a strong why, it means that you'll never be able to speak your boundaries into life, because you'll never feel like you've got a good enough reason to say no to things, right? So it means that if you don't have a strong enough why, you'll never be able to hold your boundaries, and it means you won't ever be able to slow down. So if you desire, a slower life, you need to have a why for that. What is the reason why you're desiring a slower life? And that means that you also need to be really clear on your priorities. So you need a really strong why. So maybe your why is because you've got young babies and you're just tired. And that's a legitimate reason. That's a pretty strong why. You're just not available for everything anymore because you've got a baby. And that's okay. What you then need to know is, what are your priorities? What are the things that you will say yes to? Or what are the things that by saying no, you will have time to say yes to things for? Does that make sense? So when you know your priorities and you know what you want to say yes to, it's much, much easier to say no to things that don't fulfill those priorities. So meaning that if you're a mom with a new baby at home and you're just, getting through each day, your priority might just be resting and looking after your baby. And that's it. That might just be it. And that's completely fine. You may want to get out of the house once a day. And then if you're wanting to slow down and people are pushing back on that, then you've got a strong enough why to fall back on, right? So that's the second thing you need. So you need a strong why and you need to know your priorities. But you also need a plan, meaning like when someone asks you to something and you can't come, or you don't want to go, but like you don't technically have anything else in the diary, you need kind of like a bit of a backup, like an automatic canned response. Like, what are you going to say? And it doesn't, like I said at the start, you don't need to justify yourself, right? You don't need to over-explain yourself, and it doesn't need to be a confrontation, but you do need to have a bit of a plan. Say like, oh, I know when I had my babies and I was just feeling so stretched and so tired, I was just always like, I would love to do that. I just don't know if I've got capacity at the moment because the baby's not sleeping. Now, when you're a new mum and you've got a baby, you've got all the excuses in the world and no one can really push back. So it's a really good time to practice holding boundaries because, you've got a bit of leeway. But if this is something that's not comfortable for you, even at what it might be a workplace thing, right? You can say, look, I need to check my diary. Can I get back to you? Or, I when I first started realizing that I needed more time at home to just keep on top of the things that mattered to me, like spending time with the kids or like, doing the groceries and finding time to do things outside of like, not jamming every single day. Like I just decided some personal rules. Like we'll only go to one party on a day. Like I'm not going to go to a morning party and then run around and go to an afternoon party. So I only say yes. And the thing is like what I do, I only say yes to one thing. And what I do is I make sure in advance, like I know what I'm going to say no to. So if I don't feel like doing that particular thing today, I'm not going to feel like doing it in 3 weeks. And that's completely fine. You have to get to a space where you feel really good and fine with that and know yourself and know that what you desire is the most important thing. It's not what other people think that's the most important thing. It's not other people's judgments that count. It's what you feel good about. You might feel the pressure to do a lot of extracurricular activities, for example, like the kids need to do soccer and tennis and swimming and a musical instrument and they should be, I don't know, joined up at this kids' gym or whatever, like all the things. But do you know what? They need, particularly little kids, they need a lot of downtime to just be bored and to play at home and free play time. And so what I decided was, early on, my husband and I talked about it and we said we won't sign the kids up to anything unless they ask us. And if they're really adamant that that's something that they want to do and they get to do swimming was a definite. They definitely have to do swimming. We live in Queensland. We do a lot of time around water. But if they want to do something else, it has to be them leading the way because it's much, much easier, I find. Like if you sign them up for something that they don't really want to do and then you're forcing them to do it and they're like, I don't want to go. Like, you've got that mum guilt, right? But if they're saying like, I want to do tennis and then there's a day where they don't feel like going, you can kind of like say, well, you made a commitment and it's a teaching moment, but they don't have to have extra, that pressure to put them into so many extracurricular activities. It puts a strain and on the family, it puts a strain on your finances as well. Not all activities are cheap. So there's something to be said for that, having some personal rules or having some family rules. One of my canned answers is I have prior obligation, which is downtime for us. Exactly. You can say you have a prior obligation. It doesn't mean that you actually have anything in the diary. It's not a lie. White space at home is a prior obligation, right? And that's where we need to value non-productive time because how can we keep on top of everything that we feel like that mental load if we never give ourselves the time and space to actually do those things? When we're trying to slot cleaning and doing a load of washing and reading stories into like 5 minutes slots and trying to fit so much in, that's where we get overwhelmed and burned out and we just feel resentful and motherhood's not as fun. And motherhood can and should be fun as much as possible anyway. Like we put a lot into our motherhood journey, so I think that we should be able to get out of it what we put in. And finding the joy in the everyday moments, it really does happen when you start to follow what you actually desire. And there's nothing to be ashamed about when it comes to, following your own desires. We need more people doing things that light them up rather than doing things out of obligation or because they should or for the money value of it. Like some things that we do might not necessarily be financially productive either. So that's also something to think about. Anyway, that is my piece on that. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing if you aren't already. And if you are interested in working together with me, either in a one-on-one coaching capacity or if you want to join my Slow Life program or the Matriarch Way, which will be back again in February after the school holidays, please consider joining my email list. My email, you can subscribe at my website. It's howtoliveslow.com. And I do share really valuable emails once a week with podcast episodes and thoughts about motherhood, slow living, and self-leadership. So if that sounds like something, which I'm assuming, having listened all this way through the episode, that does sound like something that you're interested in, please consider subscribing so I can send you some freebies and send you some love each week with some beautiful slow living inspiration. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Thank you again for joining me. Take care, and I'll see you again on another episode. That's it for another episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you'd like to connect further, the show notes from today's episode, including all the social links and free resources, are over on my website, howtoliveslow.com/podcast. Have a beautiful week ahead, and I'll speak with you again soon.